I put the kettle on the stove and settled in my favorite chair by the window with a new book. Evening was falling slowly in Vermont, painting the sky a soft pink that gradually changed to a deep blue. My house on Maple Street always seemed especially cozy at this time of day, when the hustle and bustle of the day had subsided and I could finally be alone with myself and my thoughts. The novel I picked up at the Central Library last week promised to be interesting. The story of a middle-aged woman who, after the death of her husband, decides to make a radical change in her life and travels to Europe. The librarian, Mary Collins, who had worked there for 20 years and knew the tastes of all the regular readers, recommended it as a very relevant work for modern women who are not afraid to start over. But already after the first 20 pages, realized that the author got too carried away with psychological descriptions of the heroine's inner world. The woman in the book was constantly analyzing every feeling, digging into childhood traumas, looking for deep philosophical reasons for the most ordinary worldly decisions. In real life, everything is much simpler and more pragmatic. People act in a certain way, not because of complex psychological complexes, but because of the circumstances, because it is necessary to solve specific problems here and now. The whistle of the kettle interrupted my thoughts about the shortcomings of modern literature. I got up, turned off the stove, and brewed green tea with jasmine, a habit I'd picked up a few years ago after reading a magazine article about the benefits of antioxidants for older women. My doctor also advised me to drink more herbal teas instead of coffee so as not to burden my heart with extra caffeine. Returning to the window with a steaming cup in my hands, I looked out onto the street, where the streetlights were already on, illuminating the neat front gardens of the neighbors' houses. Fairmont was a small town in the western part of the state, where everyone knew their neighbors within a few blocks, and where rarely did anything really dramatic or unexpected happen. It was a measured country life that many people found boring, but which suited me just fine after all the storms and turmoil of my youth. In the house across the street from where the Bruces lived, a bright light burned in the living room. Through the unshaded windows, I could see the silhouettes of Jennifer and Michael, a young couple eating dinner on the couch in front of the big TV. They had married 2 years ago, bought this two-story house with a small garden, and now they were settling in, gradually furnishing the rooms and planning renovations. Jennifer worked as a math teacher at the local high school. Michael worked as a senior mechanic at a car service at the entrance to the city. Simple, hard-working people who didn't pretend to be anything special and didn't pretend to be more than they were. I loved watching their measured family life, how they worked together in the garden on weekends, how they greeted each other after work, how they walked around the neighborhood holding hands in the evenings. There was that natural closeness in their relationship that comes between people when they truly fit each other in character and life values. I remembered myself at their age, full of energy and ambition, confident that life would turn out exactly as I envisioned it. I was 28 when I married Robert Cragton, a handsome and charming man who worked as a manager in a construction company and knew how to court. At that time, it seemed that we had a wonderful future ahead of us. A large family with several children, a spacious house, traveling together, a stable financial situation. The reality turned out to be much more modest and complicated than my youthful dreams. Robert, as it turned out, was a frivolous and irresponsible man who could not handle serious commitments. When our son Edward was 2 years old, Robert became infatuated with a young secretary in his office and eventually left her, leaving us destitute and unsupported. 45 years have passed since then, but I still remember the feeling of confusion and despair that swept over me after he left. A young woman with a small child in her arms, no higher education, no experience of independent work. The prospects were not the brightest, but I managed. I got a job as a secretary at a small law firm, worked part-time as a janitor at the office center on weekends, and took on extra work at home. Edward and I lived modestly, but we had everything we needed. Edward grew up to be a smart and responsible boy who understood that his mother was having a hard time, and he tried not to cause unnecessary problems. He did well in school, helped around the house, and never demanded expensive toys or fancy clothes. After high school, he went to a state college to study computer technology, earned a bachelor's degree, and found a good job at an IT company that developed software for small businesses. He and I were always very close, sharing all our joys and problems with each other and making important decisions together. Edward was not just a son, he was my best friend and my main support in life. So, when at 30 he married Sarah Winston, a girl from a good family who worked as a receptionist in a dental clinic, I rejoiced at his happiness, even though I realized that our relationship would change. Edward's first marriage lasted only 3 years and ended rather painfully. Sarah was a capricious and demanding woman who wanted a luxurious life, but didn't want to make much effort to live it. She constantly compared her life to that of her friends who had married wealthier men and reproached Edward for his lack of ambition. Eventually, she met the owner of a restaurant chain and left him, leaving Edward with a broken heart and serious debts. After the divorce, the son was on his own for several years, focusing on his work and gradually getting his financial affairs in order. He rented a small apartment not far from my house, and we began to see each other often again, just like old times. In the evenings, he would come over for dinner, and on weekends, we would go to the movies or to concerts at the local cultural center. I was glad that my son needed my support again, even though I realized that this situation was temporary. 2 years ago, Chelsea Wilson came into Edward's life. She was a senior manager in the regional office of a large insurance company, a responsible position with a decent salary. She was 32 years old, had her own apartment in a nice neighborhood, drove a new car, and was completely independent financially. Outwardly, Chelsea was an attractive woman of medium height with brown hair and intelligent brown eyes who knew how to dress well and keep herself in society. When Edward had first brought her to visit me a year ago, I'd noticed how he'd changed around her. He looked more confident, smiled more often, and paid more attention to his appearance. Chelsea made a positive impression on me. She was polite and attentive, asking about family traditions, looking at pictures of Edward as a child and young man, praising my cooking. The first few months of their serious relationship had been wonderful. The three of us often spent evenings at dinner, discussing weekend plans, watching family movies. Chelsea seemed genuinely interested in becoming a part of our little family. She asked me to teach her how to make Edward's favorite dishes, curious about the history of our town, asking about what it had been like as a child. I felt like I'd finally found not just a daughter-in-law, but the daughter I'd never had before. But gradually, the relationship started to get complicated. At first, it was just minor things that you could ignore. Chelsea began to agree to dinners together less often, citing fatigue after a busy day at work or plans with coworkers. Then she began to delicately hint that the young couple needed more time alone to get to know each other better and build their own traditions. I understood the logic of her reasoning, but I couldn't quite agree with that approach. Edward was my only child, and after his father had left the family when he was only 2, I had devoted my entire life to my son. I worked from early morning until late at night, denied myself entertainment and new purchases to ensure that he would have a good education and a decent future. Edward and I had been together through all the difficulties, his teenage problems, his search for himself as a young man, his failed first marriage, and his painful divorce. We were a team that coped with all of life's challenges, supporting each other in difficult moments. Now that he had started a new family, was I supposed to just disappear from his life as if all those years of closeness and mutual support didn't exist? The phone rang suddenly and abruptly, making me wince and snap out of my reverie. I looked at the display and saw my son's name. Edward usually called me on Saturday mornings or Sunday afternoons, when he had time for a leisurely conversation. It was almost 9:30 on a Wednesday night which was unusual for our phone conversations. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded tense, as if he were carefully controlling every word. Hello, Edward. How are things at work? You sound tired. Yeah, it's been a long day. We're doing a big project and everyone's nervous. What are you doing? Reading, drinking tea. I borrowed a novel from the library, but it was a bit boring. Too much psychology, not enough action. I heard him laugh softly, and it lightened the atmosphere a little. Edward was always joking about my literary tastes, saying that I preferred books that were clear and logical, and that modern authors were too fond of complicating simple things. Mom, I wanted to warn you about tomorrow. The tone of his voice became serious again. Don't come over tomorrow. Chelsea and I have an important conversation planned, and we'd like to discuss some things alone. My heart clenched with a bad feeling. In my 46 years of motherhood, I'd learned to recognize my son's tone when he was talking about something serious. The family matters that the newlyweds wanted to discuss in private had lately centered on me. The frequency of my visits, my advice on housekeeping, my involvement in planning their affairs together. I see. I tried to keep my voice calm. What exactly are your concerns? Is there anything I can do to help solve the problem? Mom, don't worry so much. There's nothing wrong. It's just that we're having some disagreements about, you know, about how to make a family life work. We need to think things through and find a compromise. Of course, I was well aware of the differences. Chelsea had been unhappy for months that I was too often in their home, too interested in their plans, and too insistent in offering to help with household tasks. Several times I'd noticed her discreetly displeased looks when I'd dropped by without calling them first, or when I'd given her my opinion on how to organize the household. All right, Edward, I won't bother you. But if you need my help or advice, you know you can always count on me. Thank you, Mom. I know that and I really appreciate it. You've always been my biggest support in life. After he said goodbye and disconnected, I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time, looking out the window at the empty evening street. The Bruce house across the street had fallen into darkness. The young couple had apparently moved into a bedroom or gone to bed. The street lights illuminated the sidewalks with cold white light, creating crisp, geometric shadows under the old maples that had been growing along the road for decades. I realized that a looming family conflict was almost inevitable. Chelsea had tolerated my active presence in their married life for quite some time, but her patience was wearing thin. Like any normal woman, she wanted a personal, intimate relationship with her husband, uncomplicated by the constant interference of her mother-in-law. From her point of view, this desire was quite reasonable and fair. But from my point of view, the situation looked quite different. I did not interfere in their family affairs out of idle curiosity or a desire to control everything. I really cared about my son's well-being. I wanted his second marriage to be more successful than the first, so that he would not repeat the same mistakes. My life experience, my knowledge of his character and habits could be useful for a young family. Is it wrong for a mother to want to help her only child find true happiness? I got up from my chair and slowly walked upstairs to my bedroom on the second floor. It was furnished with the dark wood furniture I'd bought back in the early 80s, when I'd first moved into the house after my painful divorce from Robert. I dreamed then that someday there would be a nursery for my grandchildren, that the house would be filled with family gatherings and the joyful noise of several generations. The morning began with me waking up earlier than usual, at 7:30 instead of the usual 8 in the morning. My sleep was restless, full of vague, disturbing dreams that I couldn't quite remember, but which left me feeling tense and tired. It was light outside my bedroom window, though the sun had not yet risen above the roofs of the neighboring houses, and the whole world seemed shrouded in the soft gray haze of early morning. Getting out of bed, I threw on a robe and went down to the kitchen to make coffee. I usually preferred green tea, but today I needed a stronger stimulant. a long day that needed to be filled somehow, so I didn't have to think about Edward's conversation with Chelsea and its possible consequences. The coffee maker whirred softly, filling the kitchen with the familiar aroma that I always associated with the start of a new day and new possibilities. After drinking my first cup of coffee, standing at the kitchen window and watching our quiet neighborhood wake up, I made a plan in my mind for the day's activities. I had to go to the grocery store since the refrigerator was almost empty, then stop by the dry cleaners to pick up the winter coat I'd dropped off last Friday. After lunch, I planned to do some general cleaning in the living room, move furniture, wash the windows, and clean the carpet. Physical activity has always helped me deal with stress and anxious thoughts. By 9 a.m., I was completely ready to leave the house. I put on my comfortable low-heeled shoes, grabbed a large shopping bag, and my car keys. My old but reliable sedan was parked in the garage I'd rented from the McDonald's neighbors for over a decade. It wasn't new. I had turned 15 this year, but it served me well for trips around town and occasionally out of town. The drive to the mall took about 20 minutes. I took my time, enjoying the calmness of the morning traffic and the opportunity to peruse the familiar streets of our city once again. Fairmont was where I'd lived most of my adult life, and every block, every building had some special meaning to me. Here's the house where my friend Susan lived before she moved into a nursing home. Here was the school where Edward had gone to school and where I'd been to parent-teacher conferences more than once. And here's the children's clothing store where I bought him things when he was little, and we lived very modestly. At the supermarket, I methodically went through all the departments, putting the groceries in the cart according to the list I had made in advance. Fresh fruits and vegetables, dairy products, cereals, canned goods, everything that formed the basis of my simple but healthy diet. In the meat department, I bought a small piece of beef for stewing and chicken for soup. At the checkout counter, I noticed that the total amount of my purchases was more than usual by almost $30. Food prices were constantly rising, and my modest pension was covering less and less of my living expenses every year. From the supermarket, I went to the dry cleaners, which was located in the old part of town, not far from the train station. The owner of the place, an elderly Korean man named Mr. Kim, had been taking my clothes to be cleaned for almost 20 years. He was a man of few words, but conscientious in his work and honest in his calculations. The coat was finished and looked as good as new, even though I had bought it 7 years ago at a discount store. "Mrs. Cragton," said Mr. Kim, accepting my money for the service, "it's a very nice coat. Quality fabric, it will last a long time." "Thank you, Mr. Kim. It's hard to find really good quality items at a reasonable price these days." He nodded with understanding. As someone who dealt with a wide variety of clothes on a daily basis, he understood better than most the difference between real quality and ostentatious cheap beauty. I got home about 12:30, put my purchases in their places, and made myself a light breakfast of oatmeal with raisins and a cup of herbal tea. I ate slowly, savoring the flavor and trying not to think about what was going on at her son's house. Edward was at work, but Chelsea, who worked a flexible schedule, could be at home thinking about the serious conversation she was about to have with her husband. After breakfast, I started cleaning the living room. I moved the heavy sofa and armchairs out of the way to vacuum under them, dusted all the surfaces, washed the mirrors and picture frames. The work was physically demanding, but that's what I needed: a chance to focus on specific actions and keep my thoughts from wandering in circles back to family problems. As I was cleaning the large living room window, I saw Doris Hammond, a neighbor who lived in the house across the street, approaching my house. Doris was a woman my age, a widow who had lost her husband 3 years ago to a heart attack. We were not close friends, but we maintained a friendly relationship and occasionally chatted across the fence about local news and events in our family's lives. Doris was an outgoing and curious person who knew almost everything about everyone in our neighborhood. She was in the habit of having long conversations with the mailman, with the delivery drivers, with the repairmen who showed up at different houses from time to time. This kept her abreast of all the local gossip, family dramas, and domestic problems of the neighbors. I opened the door before Doris could even ring the bell. "Hi, Rita," she said, fixing her short gray haircut. "Am I interrupting?" I was just passing by and thought I'd stop by. "Of course you are. Come on in. I'm just finishing cleaning up. Do you want coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be great, if it's not too much trouble." We went into the kitchen and I put the kettle on, got instant coffee and cookies out of the cupboard. Doris sat down at the small kitchen table, which overlooked the backyard with its apple tree and vegetable beds. "Your house is always so cozy," she said, looking around, "and it's always so perfectly clean. I sometimes wonder where you get the energy to do all this housework." "Habit," I answered, pouring coffee into cups. "When you've been running a household alone all your life, you develop a rhythm, and cleaning becomes almost automatic. After Frank died, I couldn't adjust to living alone. The house seems too big, too quiet. Sometimes I turn on the TV just for background, so I don't feel so alone." Doris was an emotional woman who could not hide her feelings. After her husband's death, she was deeply depressed for several months, refusing to leave the house or meet people. Gradually, she recovered from the shock, but loneliness still gave her a hard time. "How are things with Edward and his new wife?" she asked, sipping her coffee. I hadn't seen them in the yard in a while. "They're fine," I answered cautiously. "They both work a lot, so they're not home as much during the day." "How's Chelsea doing? Is she getting used to our town?" She'd lived in a big city before, so she must be a little bored here. "I think she's used to it. At least she's never complained." Doris was silent for a moment, then leaned closer to me across the table, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. "Do you know what's going on at the Johnstons? Yesterday I saw Linda carrying suitcases out of the house and loading them into the car. Paul was standing on the porch yelling something after her. Sounds like a domestic dispute." The Johnstons lived in a house on the corner of our street. Paul worked as an insurance agent. Linda was a housewife with two teenage children. On the surface, they seemed like a well-to-do middle-class family, but as it turned out, appearances could be deceiving. "Probably just visiting relatives for a few days," I suggested, though Doris's description didn't sound very optimistic. "No, Rita, I'm not blind. There were a lot of suitcases, and she'd taken the kids with her. I think she's leaving him for good." I also saw a man in an expensive car come over the other day and have a long talk with Linda in the yard while Paul was out. Doris was clearly relishing the opportunity to share sensational news, but I was uncomfortable with the gossip. Other people's family dramas always gave me mixed feelings. On the one hand, natural human curiosity, and on the other hand, the realization that behind every such story, there was real suffering of specific people. "You know, Doris, maybe they're just having temporary difficulties. Sometimes people split up for a while to work things out, and then they reconcile." "Well, yes, of course," Doris agreed without much conviction, although the statistics of divorce nowadays are just horrifying. If you read the news, every second marriage ends in divorce. And how many families fall apart because young people don't know how to compromise, don't want to be patient, and work on their relationships? Yes, times have changed, I agreed. In the past, people valued family more and tried to save their marriage at any cost. Now, at the first sign of trouble, many people would rather just leave and start over with someone else. "And also," Doris continued, clearly getting into the swing of things, "parents interfere too much now, especially mothers-in-law. I know of several cases when young families have fallen apart because of conflicts with the parents of their husbands. Women do not want to tolerate when the mother-in-law tries to manage their household or upbringing of children." My heart squeezed painfully at those words. Did Doris really know about our family problems and hinted at them? Or was it just a coincidence, a common topic of conversation among women our age? On the other hand, I said cautiously, the experience of the older generation can be helpful. We've been through a lot of difficulties. We know how to solve certain problems. Is it wrong for a mother to want to help her son or daughter? Of course it's not wrong, Doris agreed, but it depends on how the help is offered. If it's unobtrusive when it's asked for, that's one thing, but if it's constantly interfering, criticizing, giving unsolicited advice, that's a different story. We finished our coffee, discussing local news of a less personal nature. Doris told me about the municipality's plans to renovate a playground on a nearby block, about a new doctor who had opened a practice downtown, about the upcoming Harvest Festival that was traditionally held in our town every fall. These mundane topics helped me take my mind off my anxious thoughts and return to normalcy. After Doris left, I sat in the kitchen for a while, reflecting on our conversation. Her words about family conflict and the role of mothers-in-law in destroying marriages sounded too close to my own situation to be a mere coincidence. Perhaps rumors were already starting to spread in our small town about the problems in Edward's family, or Doris was just more observant than I thought. In the afternoon, I set about making lunch, though I didn't have much of an appetite. I stewed vegetables with a little beef, made rice and a salad of fresh tomatoes and cucumbers. I ate slowly, standing by the window and watching the life on the street. Children from neighboring houses were returning from school. Women went out into the yards to hang laundry or water the flowers in the front gardens. The ordinary, measured life of a small American town, where every day is like the day before, where people know each other and live by established traditions. I've always liked that predictability, that sense of stability and security. But today, the familiar surroundings were not comforting. My premonitions about the evening's conversation at my son's house were too strong. After lunch, I decided to go downtown to solve a few financial issues at the bank and take a short walk along the familiar streets. Staying at home with anxious thoughts about the upcoming family conversation was becoming more and more difficult, and I felt the need for movement, for a change of scenery, for people to distract me from my obsessive thoughts about the future of my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. The central part of Fairmont was small but quite picturesque. The main street was lined with 2- and 3-story buildings from the turn of the last century, many of which had recently been restored to their original appearance. Stores, cafes, offices of small companies, and municipal offices all created the atmosphere of a thriving American town that cherished its history and traditions. The bank was located in the heart of the business district, in a beautiful red brick building with high arched windows. I had been a customer of the bank for over 20 years, ever since I had just moved to Fairmont after my divorce. The staff knew me by sight, and I felt comfortable here, like a familiar, safe place where I was always treated with respect and understanding. I had to make my monthly payment on my homeowner's insurance and check on my savings account, where I had been saving small amounts for unexpected expenses. The money was slow to accumulate, the pension was modest, and life was getting more expensive. But I tried to put away at least $50 or $70 each month. At my age, it's important to have a financial safety cushion in case of illness or other emergencies. The bank was pretty crowded for the middle of the workday. I got in line at the teller's window and was looking at the announcements on the bulletin board when I heard someone calling my name. Rita Cragton, what a nice meeting. I turned around and saw Barbara Kennedy, a woman about my age, whom we had met a few years ago at a community senior center. Barbara was an energetic and outgoing widow who was active in various social activities in town. She ran a gardening club, organized charity bazaars, and was one of those people who seemed to know everyone and everything. "Hi, Barbara," I replied, genuinely pleased to meet you. "How are you? I haven't seen you in a while." Same old, same old. She came closer, and I could see the tiredness in her usually cheerful blue eyes. Although lately, family matters have added a few gray hairs. You know how it is with children. They seem to be all grown up and on their own, but they're just as much trouble as they were when they were little. What happened? I asked, sensing that Barbara needed to share her worries with someone who understood. Barbara looked around, making sure no one was listening, and lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. Remember I told you about my son David and his wife Christina? Well, she and I have a serious conflict. She thinks I interfere too much in their family life. My heart raced at the unexpected similarity of her situation to my own. I nodded, signaling that I was ready to hear the details. You see? Barbara continued, nervously adjusting her purse on her shoulder. After George died, David was my only support. He helped me with my paperwork, with the house repairs. We often had dinner together. And when he married Christine 2 years ago, I thought our good relationship would only grow stronger. After all, now I also had the daughter I had always dreamed of. She was silent, gathering her thoughts, and I waited patiently, realizing that this conversation could shed light on my own situation. Everything was fine at first, Barbara continued. Christine was polite, friendly. We cooked family dinners together, went shopping together. I even helped her pick out furniture for their new apartment. But gradually something started to change. She became colder, finding excuses to avoid family gatherings. What exactly was wrong with her? I asked her cautiously. She thought I came over too often uninvited, that I give unsolicited advice on housekeeping, that I criticize her cooking and cleaning methods, and last week she'd told David she was tired of my constant presence in their lives. Barbara looked upset and confused. Her usual self-confidence was gone, and I was looking at an older woman who didn't understand how she was suddenly guilty of trying to be a caring mother. You see, Rita, she continued, I'm not angry. I just want to help the young, to share my experience. I have 35 years of married life. I know how to avoid many mistakes. Is that a bad thing? Of course not bad, I agreed. But maybe the younger generation really needs more autonomy. Maybe they want to make their own mistakes and learn from their own experiences? Maybe, Barbara sighed. But it hurts me so much to feel unwanted. All my life I've needed my husband, my son, my home, and now it turns out that my care is perceived as a nuisance. The line moved forward, and we found ourselves at the cashier's window. I quickly resolved my financial issues, and Barbara paid some utility bills. As we left the bank, we stood on the steps for a few more minutes, continuing our conversation. How are things with your family? Barbara asked. Your son got married recently, didn't he? Yes, last year, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. So far, so good. But sometimes there are little misunderstandings. I guess that's natural in a period of adjustment. You know, Barbara said, putting on her sunglasses, I think it's just hard for us women of our generation to accept that times have changed. Big families used to be the norm, and all generations lived together, or at least very close. Now the young want complete independence. Yes, maybe you're right, I agreed, although deep down I wasn't sure that complete independence was always a good thing. We said goodbye, and I walked slowly down the main street toward the parking lot where I'd left my car. The conversation with Barbara had made me look at my own situation in a new way. It turned out that conflicts between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law were fairly common, not a unique problem in my family. This was both comforting and sad at the same time. On the way home, I stopped at a small flower shop and bought a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums for the living room. Flowers always lifted my spirits and made my home feel festive and cozy. The sales clerk, a young girl with a friendly smile, beautifully wrapped the bouquet in transparent paper with a golden ribbon. A fine choice, she said. Chrysanthemums are very long-lasting, and the yellow color is so sunny, uplifting in the fall weather. I smiled back at her, thinking how simple and straightforward everything seems to young people. Yellow flowers for good mood, communication with friends to solve problems, love and mutual understanding as the basis of family happiness. If only everything were so simple in real life. At home, I put the chrysanthemums in a beautiful vase and placed them on the coffee table in the living room. The flowers really transformed the room, made it more lively and joyful. I made myself a late lunch, a light salad, and a cup of green tea, and sat by the window, watching the life outside. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and our neighborhood was slowly coming to life. Kids were coming home from school, some neighbors were coming home early from work. I saw Mrs. Adams at number 27 walking her old Labrador, a teenager with a bicycle delivering the evening paper, a young mother with a stroller heading toward the children's playground, with a stroller heading for the playground at the end of the street. A normal, peaceful picture of suburban life that usually had a calming effect on me. But tonight, I couldn't take my mind off the evening ahead and what decisions Edward and Chelsea might make as a result of their serious conversation. Around 5:30, I saw a familiar figure walking down the sidewalk toward my house. Chelsea walked with a quick, determined stride, her face focused and tense. She was dressed in a navy blue business suit, her hair neatly tucked into a low bun. She must have come straight from work. My heart quickened with surprise. Chelsea never came to my house alone, not without Edward, and especially not at this time of day. Usually when they visited me, they'd call beforehand to arrange a time. Her sudden appearance at my house could only mean one thing. She was here for the serious conversation she and my son were planning to have alone that evening. I got up from the table and walked to the front door, waiting for the bell to ring. Through the glass insert in the door, I watched Chelsea walk up the porch steps and stop in front of the door, gathering her thoughts. Her face was determined, but I could see that her hands were trembling slightly, as if she was struggling with this conversation as much as I was. The call rang sharply and insistently. I took a deep breath, prepared for the possibility that this conversation would drastically change my relationship with my son and his family, and opened the door. "Hi, Chelsea," I said as calmly as I could. "What a surprise. Please come in." But I could tell by the look on her face that she wasn't here for a polite family visit. In her eyes, I saw the determination of a person who was ready to speak directly and openly, without hiding her true feelings behind social conventions. "Thank you," Chelsea said briefly as she walked into the hallway. "We need to have a serious talk." Chelsea walked into the living room without waiting for an invitation and stopped in the middle of the room, facing me. Her posture was tense, her shoulders squared, her chin slightly raised, the posture of someone who was preparing for a confrontation and had no intention of backing down. I closed the front door and followed her slowly, trying to keep my exterior calm, though my heart was pounding with the anticipation of an unpleasant conversation. "Would you like some tea or coffee?" I offered out of habit, hoping at least to diffuse the tense atmosphere a little. "No, thank you," Chelsea said sharply, not sitting down in the chair, though I gestured for her to sit down. "I'm not here for small talk over a cup of tea. You and I have a serious problem that needs to be resolved immediately." She stood up straight with her arms crossed over her chest and looked at me straight in the eye. There was no anger or hatred in her gaze, but something colder and more decisive, a firm conviction that she was right, and a willingness to see the conversation through, no matter how painful the consequences. I sat down in my favorite chair by the window, where I usually read in the evenings, and folded my hands in my lap. I wanted to look calm and collected, but inside I was shrinking with anxiety. I'd learned over the years not to show my true feelings in times of crisis, an ability that had helped me deal with difficult situations more than once. "I'm listening to you," I said in an even tone. "What problem do you want to talk about?" Chelsea took a deep breath, as if gathering her resolve for a prepared speech. I could tell that, despite her confidence, she was nervous. Her fingers trembled slightly, and her voice sounded strained. Rita, she began, and there was a note in her voice that I hadn't heard before, a mixture of despair and determination. I can't live like this anymore. Your constant presence in our family life is ruining my marriage to Edward. The words sounded like a slap, though I'd expected something like that. Still, it was painful to hear such a direct accusation. I stared at her in silence, giving her a chance to speak her mind. Every time Edward and I try to make a family decision, Chelsea continued, pacing the room, he consults with you first. When we plan a weekend or a vacation, he asks your opinion. When we buy something for the house, you show up with advice and criticism. She stopped by the coffee table with a bouquet of chrysanthemums and turned sharply toward me. And even worse, you show up unannounced at our house at any time. Last Saturday, we woke up and you're already sitting in the kitchen making breakfast. In our house. In our kitchen. It's like it's your house and we're just temporary guests. Chelsea's voice was getting louder and more emotional. It was obvious that she had been holding back these grievances for a long time, and now it was all coming out. You criticize my cooking, my cleaning, my housekeeping. You keep telling Edward what his first wife did wrong, insinuating that I might repeat her mistakes. You make remarks about how I dress, where I work, who I'm friends with. I listened to her monologue, trying to remain calm, even though some of the accusations seemed unfair to me. Yes, I did drop by unannounced sometimes, but always with good intentions, to help, to support, to share my experiences. Yes, I expressed my opinion on various household issues, but only because I wanted to protect my son from repeating the same mistakes. The worst part, Chelsea continued, tears welling up in her voice, is that Edward doesn't see the problem. It's normal for him to have his mother involved in every aspect of our lives. He grew up in an atmosphere where you were the center of his universe, and he doesn't understand that a grown, married man should put his wife first. She stopped in front of me and looked straight into my eyes. I love Edward, she said quietly, but no less forcefully. I want a happy marriage with him, children, a normal family life, but I can't live in his mother's shadow. I can't be the wife of a man who is still more psychologically attached to his mother than to his wife. There was silence. Chelsea stood there, breathing heavily after her emotional speech, and I pondered her words. A lot of what she said was painful, but not without merit. Perhaps I really was too involved in their lives, too used to being the primary counselor and helper in my son's family. Finished? I asked calmly. Chelsea nodded, wiping away her tears. Then tell me honestly, I continued, what exactly do you want from me? What do you expect to get out of this conversation? I want you to stop controlling our lives. She answered without hesitation. Stop giving unsolicited advice. I want you to stop calling before you visit and only come when you're invited. Let Edward and I build our own family without constant interference. What if I don't agree to those terms? I asked. Chelsea paused, gathering her thoughts, then said in a tone that wasn't threatening, but unwavering determination, then I'll give Edward a choice. Either he sets healthy boundaries with you, or I leave him. I'm not ready to spend the rest of my life sharing a husband with his mother. Those words sounded like the ultimate ultimatum. I knew Chelsea wasn't bluffing. There was too much sincerity and desperation in her voice and demeanor. She was truly ready to destroy the marriage if things didn't change. I got up from my chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the familiar street where most of my adult life had taken place. The house across the street where the Bruces lived. The old maple trees I'd seen every day for decades. A quiet, measured life that was suddenly in danger of drastic change. You know, Chelsea, I said without turning to her. I met an acquaintance this afternoon who told me a similar story. conflict with her sister-in-law, claims of interference. Turns out these problems are quite common. I turned to face her. Maybe the problem is not with specific people, but with the fact that our generation is really too used to control and patronize, and your generation values independence and autonomy more. Chelsea listened attentively, apparently not expecting such a turn in the conversation. I don't want to ruin my son's marriage, I continued. I don't want him to have to choose between his mother and his wife. That would be cruel of me. So you're saying? Chelsea began, not quite believing what she was hearing. I agree to your demands, I said simply. No more surprise visits, no more unsolicited advice, no interference in your family decisions. I will only come by invitation and call ahead. Chelsea's face expressed a mixture of relief and disbelief. She'd clearly been preparing for a long and painful struggle, and she'd gotten an unexpectedly simple agreement. But I want you to understand, I added, that my advice and involvement were not out of a desire to hurt or control. I just wanted to help, to share my experience, to keep Edward from making mistakes. I understand, Chelsea nodded. And I don't think you had evil intentions. It's just that we have very different ideas about family relationships. Yeah, I agreed. And maybe it was time for me to accept that. Chelsea gathered up her purse and headed for the exit. She stopped at the door and turned to me. Thank you for listening and understanding, she said. I hope we can have a normal relationship now. I hope so too, I replied. After she left, I went back into the living room and sat down in the chair by the window. It was starting to get dark behind the glass. The days of fall were getting shorter and shorter, and evening was coming early. I looked at the yellow chrysanthemums in the vase and thought about how life sometimes changes very quickly and unexpectedly. In the morning, I had been a caring mother who was actively involved in the life of my son and his family. And now I had made a promise to become a much more distanced, more formal figure in their relationship. Was this the right decision? Time will tell. After the door closed behind Chelsea, I remained standing in the hallway, listening to the sound of her receding footsteps on the wooden porch steps. There was a silence in the house that seemed especially profound after the emotional scene that had just played out in my living room. I walked slowly back into the room and sat down in the same chair where I had sat during the conversation with my sister-in-law. But now everything seemed different, as if the familiar surroundings of the house had taken on some new, unfamiliar hue. The bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums still stood on the coffee table, but even these bright flowers, which had lifted my spirits an hour ago, now looked sad and lifeless in the fading daylight. Outside the window, dusk was slowly falling, and the streetlights began to come on one by one, illuminating the empty street, where the cars of neighbors returning home from work to their families occasionally passed by. I tried to analyze the conversation I'd just had, to weigh the fairness of Chelsea's claims against the honesty of my own motives. Was it true what she'd said about my excessive interference in their family life? Was I really controlling every aspect of their relationship, or was I just trying to be a helpful and caring mother? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that many of her accusations had a real basis in fact. Yes, I did drop by unannounced often, believing it was a mother's natural right to visit her son. Yes, I gave my opinion on how they ran their household, how they spent their money, how they planned their free time. Yes, I gave advice, even when I was not asked for it, believing that my life experience could be useful to them. But the most painful realization came when I honestly admitted to myself that Chelsea had been right about one thing. I really hadn't let Edward separate from me psychologically. After the divorce from his father, my son and I had become so close, so accustomed to sharing in each other's joys and problems, that I didn't see his marriage as the beginning of his independent adult life, but rather as an extension of our little family in which I was still the centerpiece. Rising from my chair, I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. I needed time to calm down and think about the situation without emotion. While the tea brewed, I stood at the window, looking out at the backyard, where the light from the garden lantern showed neat vegetable beds and an old apple tree that had been growing there since before we'd moved into the house. This house, how many years I've lived here, how many hopes and plans I've tied to these walls. When I'd bought it after my divorce, I thought that Edward and I would create a new happy life here, that in time the house would be filled with grandchildren, with family gatherings, with 3 generations under one roof. The reality turned out to be quite different. My son grew up, got an education, created his own family, and no longer needed that close psychological union that we both once needed to survive in difficult times. And I failed to realize it in time and let him go, continued to cling to the role of the main counselor and guardian in his life. After drinking tea and calming down a bit, I went up to my bedroom and took out a small wooden box from the closet where the most important documents were kept. Among them was a notebook with phone numbers where I wrote down contacts of people I might need in various life situations: a lawyer, a doctor, an insurance agent, a plumber, an electrician, all those specialists that an elderly person living alone would need from time to time. I found the phone number for Ronald Kane, the attorney who helped me process the purchase of my home and drafted my will 5 years ago. Ronald was a middle-aged man, professional and reliable, who never asked unnecessary questions and always clearly explained legal nuances in simple, straightforward language. Looking at my watch, I saw that it was still only 7:30 in the evening. Ronald usually worked late, especially in the middle of the week, so there was a chance I could catch him in the office. I dialed the number, and after a few beeps, I heard the familiar voice of the receptionist. Kane and Associates, good evening. Hi, this is Rita Cragton. Could you tell me if Mr. Kane is still in the office? I need to speak to him urgently. Just a moment, Mrs. Cragton. I'll check. After a brief pause, Ronald himself answered the phone. Rita, good evening. How are you? What's wrong? Ronald, I need to make some changes to my will. Quite significant changes. When can we meet? Tomorrow morning at 10, would that be okay with you? Or is there something urgent that needs immediate attention? I paused for a moment, considering my answer. Technically, there was nothing urgent. My health was fine. No threatening situations were foreseen. But psychologically, I felt it was important to make a decision quickly, as long as I had the resolve to follow through. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning is fine with me, I said. I'm just warning you that the changes will be drastic. Understood. Come with your passport and the text of the current will. See you later, Rita. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The decision had been made, but its consequences had yet to be considered and accepted. I went down to the kitchen and made myself a light dinner, a vegetable salad and a piece of boiled chicken. I didn't feel like eating, but I forced myself to eat at least half of it, realizing that my body needed strength to survive the stressful situation. After dinner, I turned on the TV and tried to concentrate on the evening news, but my thoughts kept returning to my conversation with Chelsea and my meeting with the lawyer tomorrow. The newscaster was talking about political events, economic problems, and local incidents, but it all seemed distant and unimportant compared to the upheaval that was happening in my own life. About 9:30 in the evening, Edward called. I could tell from his voice that Chelsea had already told him about our conversation. He sounded confused and worried, as if he didn't know where to start or how to feel about what had happened. Mom, he said after a brief greeting, Chelsea told me about your conversation today. I wanted to apologize for things coming to such a direct confrontation. You have nothing to apologize for, Edward, I replied calmly. Chelsea said what she thought, and she was right about a lot of things. But, Mom, she may have been a little too harsh. No, I interrupted him. She was saying things that should have been said a long time ago. I did interfere too much in your family life. Edward was silent for a moment, thinking about what I'd said. I don't want you to feel unwanted or rejected, he said finally. You've always been the most important person in my life, and that will never change. These words were both heartwarming and painful at the same time. I knew my son was being sincere, but I also knew that Chelsea was right. A married adult man couldn't put his mother before his wife if he wanted a healthy marriage. Edward, I said firmly, I've made the decision to give you and Chelsea complete freedom to build your own family. No more surprise visits, no more unsolicited advice. I will only come into your lives when you want me to. Mom, you don't have to go to extremes. It's not extreme, I countered. It's just accepting reality. You're a grown man with a family of your own, and it's time for me to fully accept that. After talking to my son, I sat in the living room for a long time, thinking about tomorrow's meeting with the lawyer. The changes I planned to make to the will were truly drastic. Instead of Edward, Claire, the daughter of my late sister, who lived in Oregon with her family, was to be the primary heir to my estate. Claire was a nice young woman of 38, working as an elementary school teacher, raising 2 children. We didn't have a close relationship, calling a few times a year on holidays, but I always had warm feelings for her. She never demanded anything from me, did not count on inheritance, lived modestly but decently. The house, the savings, the small collection of jewelry I'd inherited from my mother, all of it was to go to Claire. Edward would receive only a token amount, enough to make the will uncontested on formal grounds, but not enough to make any real difference to his well-being. Was it fair? Edward was a good son who cared for me and loved me, but he was also a man who had failed to set healthy boundaries in time with his mother, which now threatened his marriage. Maybe such a drastic step would force him to finally grow up and learn to put his wife first in his life. By 11:30 in the evening, fatigue had taken its toll, and I went up to the bedroom to get ready for bed. After changing into my nightgown, I sat down at the dressing table and began to remove my day's makeup. The mirror reflected the face of a 73-year-old woman who had gone through a major ordeal in one day and made a decision that would change her relationship with her son forever. Was it the right decision? Time will tell. But right now, on this quiet fall night, it felt like I simply had no other choice. Chelsea had given me an ultimatum, and I had chosen the only path that avoided open conflict between mother and daughter-in-law, with my son as a hostage to that conflict. As I lay in bed, I thought about the fact that tomorrow would begin a new phase of my life, a phase in which I would not be an active participant in my son's family life, but rather an honored elderly relative who appeared on special occasions and did not interfere in the daily affairs of the young family. It was painful, but perhaps necessary for all of us. In the morning, I woke up before my alarm clock, around 7:30, after a restless night full of disturbing dreams that I couldn't quite remember, but which left me feeling tired and tense. It was overcast outside my bedroom window, low gray clouds covering the sky, heralding a rainy fall day. Such weather usually depressed me, but today the grayness outside the window somehow matched my inner state. I got out of bed, showered, and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that I usually wore for important official events, funerals, bank meetings, doctor's appointments for serious matters. Today's meeting with the lawyer was definitely in the category of serious matters, which required an appropriate appearance and inner focus. Over breakfast, I reread the text of my existing will, made 5 years ago, several times. It was simple enough that Edward had inherited the bulk of my estate, with small amounts going to a few charitable organizations I'd been involved with over the years. Now things were about to change dramatically. The law firm's office was downtown, in the same building that housed the bank where I'd met Barbara yesterday. Ronald Kane had rented 2 floors of an old mansion that had been converted into office space while preserving its historic appearance. High ceilings, wide hallways, and solid wooden doors created an atmosphere of solidity and reliability that lent itself to trust. I arrived a few minutes earlier than the appointed time and spent them in the reception area, looking at the diplomas and certificates hanging on the walls, testifying to the professional qualifications of the firm's employees. The receptionist, a friendly middle-aged woman with glasses, offered me coffee, but I politely declined. My nervousness was already making itself felt, and I didn't need an extra dose of caffeine. Ronald met me in the reception area at 10 o'clock in the morning and took me to his office, a spacious room with large windows overlooking the main street of the city. There were comfortable leather armchairs behind a massive oak desk, and along the walls were shelves of legal literature and files with documents. Everything here breathed professionalism and years of experience in solving complex legal issues. "Have a seat, Rita," Ronald said, pointing to the chair opposite his desk. "Coffee, tea, water?" "No, thank you. I don't want to take up any more of your time. Let's get straight to the point." Ronald was a man of about 55, with graying hair and attentive brown eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. In the few years I had known him, he had never once shown any curiosity about his client's personal motivations, confining himself solely to the legal aspects of the matters at hand. This professional restraint was one of the reasons I had chosen him as my lawyer. "So," he said as he opened my file, "you want to amend your will. Tell me exactly what you don't like about the current version." "I want to completely change the composition of the heirs," I answered, trying to speak clearly and confidently. "Instead of my son, my niece Claire Raymond, who lives in Portland, Oregon, should be the main heir." Ronald lifted his eyes from the papers and looked at me carefully. There was no judgment or surprise in his gaze, but the professional attention of a man who wants to make sure the client fully understands the consequences of his decisions. "I do. What about Edward? Do we leave him out of the will completely, or do we leave him a token share?" "A token share," I answered after some thought. "Let's say $10,000, enough to make the document uncontested, but no more than that." Ronald nodded and made a note in his notebook. "Good. And the rest of the property? The house, the savings, the personal effects? All goes to the niece?" "All of it. The house on Maple Street, the savings in the bank accounts, the jewelry, the furniture, the car. Absolutely everything except those $10,000 for the son." Ronald looked through the documents in silence for a while, calculating the approximate value of the inheritance. The house I had bought 28 years ago for $45,000 was now worth at least $180,000. The savings were about $70,000. Plus the car, the furniture, the jewelry, it added up to a pretty good sum. "Rita," he said cautiously, "I must ask you as your lawyer. Are you acting of your own free will, without coercion or pressure from third parties?" "Absolutely of my own free will," I confirmed. "No one is forcing me to do anything." "And you fully understand that this decision could seriously affect your relationship with your son?" "I understand and accept those consequences." Ronald was silent for a moment, pondering the situation, then continued the questioning that was necessary to draw up a new document. "I will need full details of your niece: name, surname, date of birth, residential address. Do you keep in touch with her?" "Claire Elizabeth Raymond, born May 15, 1987. She lives in Portland at an address—" I dictated an address I knew by heart because I sent Christmas cards there every year. "We call a few times a year, mostly around the holidays. Does she know about your plans for the will?" "No, not yet, and I don't plan to tell her yet." Ronald took detailed notes, clarifying the legal language that would ensure that my will would be executed without the possibility of a challenge. We discussed the appointment of an executor of the will, a role Ronald himself was to fulfill, and how to notify the heirs after my death. Another important question, said the lawyer. What about the charitable organizations that had appeared in the previous version of the will? I wondered. In the old will, I had given $2,000 each to three organizations: a shelter for homeless animals, a fund for the elderly, and a local library. These amounts were small, but symbolically important to me. Let's keep them, I decided. Let each organization get $2,000, as planned before, the rest to my niece. Ronald calculated the final distribution of the inheritance and announced the result. So, it turns out, $10,000 to his son, $6,000 to the charitable organizations, and the rest of the estate with a total value of about $230,000 to $240,000 to Claire Raymond's niece. That's correct, I confirmed. We spent another half hour or so discussing the technical details, the requirements for witnesses to sign the document, the notarization procedure, the time frame for the will to take effect. Ronald explained everything patiently and thoroughly, making sure I understood every aspect of the document being drafted. It will take 2 or 3 working days to prepare a new will, he concluded. I will call you when the document is ready, and we will arrange a time to sign it in the presence of witnesses. And the existing will is automatically revoked? Yes, once the new document is signed and witnessed, the previous version is null and void. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The decision had been made definitively and irrevocably. The legal mechanism had been set in motion, and now I just had to wait for the documents to be ready. I didn't plan to notify anyone close to me about the change, not Edward or Claire. It would remain my secret until I had to reveal it. When I stepped outside, I found that it was starting to drizzle, making the gray fall day even more dreary. I opened my umbrella and walked slowly to where I'd left the car, thinking about what had happened at the lawyer's office and how it might affect my relationship with my family. Edward, of course, would be shocked when he learned of my decision. He had never counted on the inheritance as the basis for his financial well-being. He had earned a good living and was capable of providing a decent life for himself and his wife by his own labor. But symbolically, disinheritance meant more than just financial loss. It was a signal that our relationship had changed dramatically. Maybe such a radical step will help him finally grow up, learn to put his wife first in his life, to build a truly independent family. Or maybe it would finally destroy our already strained relationship. It was impossible to predict the consequences, but I couldn't see any other way out of the situation. Claire, on the other hand, would receive a completely unexpected gift from fate. Her teacher's salary did not allow her to live in luxury, and an additional $200,000 could significantly improve the life of her family, to pay for the education of her children, to buy a bigger house, to ensure a more comfortable old age. She was a good person and deserved such good fortune. When I got to the car, I got behind the wheel and sat for a while, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. I had a normal day ahead of me: grocery shopping, chores, reading, TV. But now it was all happening against the backdrop of a decision I had made that would change my life forever. Tomorrow or the day after, Ronald will call and tell me that the papers are ready to be signed. I will come to his office, sign in the presence of witnesses, and the new will take effect. After that, I'd have to wait to see how Edward would react when he found out about my decision, and whether we'd be able to maintain any semblance of a family relationship after such a drastic step. The rain intensified, turning from a light drizzle to a downpour. I turned on the engine and slowly pulled onto the road leading home. Through the watery glass, the world looked blurry and unreal, which was oddly consistent with my inner state. My whole life seemed blurry and unreal, too. The life of a caring mother, actively involved in every aspect of her son and his family's existence. Now I had to learn to be someone else, a distant older woman who only appeared in the lives of loved ones on special occasions and did not interfere in their daily affairs. It was scary and painful, but perhaps that's what the changed circumstances demanded. The next day, Friday morning, Ronald called to say that the new will was ready to be signed. We made an appointment for Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just enough time for him to arrange for the necessary witnesses and a notary to be present. After talking to the lawyer, I felt that the point of no return was getting closer by the hour, and soon I would have to put my decision on paper. The weekend passed in a strange state of suspension between past and future life. I did the usual things: cleaning, cooking, reading, watching television programs, but it all seemed to happen in slow motion, as if I were watching myself from the outside. The house seemed quieter than usual. The phone was silent, and no one disturbed my enforced isolation from the outside world. Sunday night, as I was preparing a light dinner, the doorbell rang. Through the glass pane, I could see Edward's silhouette standing on the porch, slouching slightly in the drizzle, his face a tired, confused expression. Normally, my son looked confident and collected, but now there was something of a lost man in his posture, unsure of how to solve his problems. I opened the door, and we exchanged cautious greetings. Edward was dressed in casual clothes, jeans, and a warm sweater, and looked like he'd decided to come in spontaneously, without much planning. He wasn't carrying the usual goodies he sometimes brought during his visits, which confirmed the impulsiveness of his decision to come. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Would you like some coffee? Or maybe dinner? I'm just cooking." "No, thanks, Mom. I'm not hungry, and I don't have much time. Chelsea's waiting for me at home." We went into the living room, and I motioned for him to sit in the chair across from where I usually sat. Edward didn't sit comfortably, perched on the edge of the seat as if he were preparing for a quick retreat. I could tell he was nervous, rubbing the edge of his sweater with his fingers, avoiding direct eye contact, talking a little faster than usual. "How are things with you and Chelsea?" I asked, even though I suspected it was family issues that had brought him to me at this late hour. "Not so good, to be honest," he admitted, finally lifting his eyes and looking at me directly. "After that conversation you had on Wednesday, there's been some tension between us." "Some tension between us." I nodded, letting him know that I was ready to hear the details, even though I knew what the problem might be. "You see, Mom," Edward continued, leaning forward and interlocking his fingers. "Chelsea doesn't think that I've been strong enough. I didn't support her position on the conflict, that I should have talked to you about boundaries beforehand and prevented her from having to assert her rights on her own. And how do you feel about that?" "I think she's right," he said after a brief hesitation. "I really should have pointed out earlier that your involvement in our family life was causing problems. But on the other hand, it was hard for me to talk to you about it directly." Edward got up from his chair and began to walk slowly across the room, his hands behind his back, a habit he'd kept since childhood and had picked up in moments of great excitement. "Mom, I don't want you to feel rejected or unwanted," he continued, stopping at the window and looking out at the lantern-lit, deserted street. "You've always been the most important person in my life. After my father left, you and I dealt with all the difficulties together, and I'll never forget that." "But," I prompted, sensing that there was some important clarification behind those warm words. "But I have a wife now," he said, turning to face me, "and if I want my marriage to be happy, I have to learn to put Chelsea first. That doesn't mean I stop loving you or respecting you. It just means that priorities have to change." I listened carefully to his explanation, realizing that my son was trying to find a balance between loyalty to his mother and loyalty to his wife. It was a difficult task for any man, especially one who had grown up in a single-parent family and was used to a very close relationship with his mother. "Edward," I said quietly, "what if I told you that I completely agree with Chelsea and you?" That I've really been interfering too much in your family life, and I'm willing to change that? He looked at me with surprise, apparently not expecting such an easy surrender. Really? You really think so? Absolutely serious. What's more, I've already made some decisions that will help you gain complete independence from me. Edward returned to his chair and leaned toward me, clearly intrigued by my words. What kind of decisions? I paused for a few seconds, gathering my thoughts. The moment of truth had arrived, and now I had to tell my son the news that would probably change our relationship dramatically. I've changed the will, I said in a steady, calm voice. Instead of you, your cousin Claire is now the primary beneficiary. Edward froze, as if he didn't fully understand what I was saying. There was a look of utter bewilderment on his face, which gradually changed to a realization of the seriousness of what he'd said. What? What did you say? He asked quietly. I made a will for Claire Raymond, my late sister's daughter. The house, the savings, all the rest of the estate now goes to her. I left you a token sum of $10,000. Edward leaned back in his chair slowly, trying to comprehend what I'd heard. I saw a mixture of shock, incomprehension, and growing indignation in his eyes. Mom, but why? Why? What did I do? You didn't do anything wrong, I answered patiently. Chelsea's right. You need to be completely independent of me. And as long as you're counting on the inheritance, that dependency remains. Now you can build a life based on your own strength. But Mom? Edward stood up and paced the room again, but his movements were sharper and more erratic. I never counted on your inheritance as the basis for my well-being. I work, I earn, I can provide for my family on my own. Then my decision should not create any problems for you, I objected logically. It's not about money, he exclaimed, stopping in front of me. It's about what it means. It's like, it's like you're giving up on me as a son. There was a note of pain in his voice that touched my heart, but I forced myself to remain firm in my decision. I'm not giving up on you as a son. I'm just giving you and Chelsea the complete freedom you want. Isn't that what she demanded? She demanded that you interfere less in our affairs, not that you disinherit me. How else can I demonstrate that I no longer claim to be the main man in your life? Edward stopped and looked at me with an expression that was a mixture of bewilderment, resentment, and some kind of despair. It was obvious that he was trying to find an argument that would change my mind, but he didn't know where to start. Mom, please think again. This is too radical a decision. There has to be some middle ground between total control and total rejection. I've already thought about it, I replied calmly. On Monday, I'm going to my lawyer to sign new documents. The decision is final. Does Claire know about your plans? Not yet. She'll find out after I'm dead, when the time comes. Edward sat back in his chair and covered his face with his hands. He was silent for a few minutes, probably trying to find a way to influence my decision. Mom, he said finally, raising his head, what if Chelsea and I could compromise? What if we set reasonable boundaries but still maintain a normal family relationship? Couldn't we do it in a less drastic way? Yes, I agreed, but I don't believe it would work in the long run. Sooner or later, our ideas of boundaries will diverge again, and we'll find ourselves in the same situation. But we could try. Edward, I interrupted him firmly, I've made a decision, not just for you and Chelsea, but for me. I'm 73 years old. It's time I learned to live my own life, not be an appendage to my son's. He looked at me with a long, studying stare, as if he were trying to figure out if I was being serious or if this was some kind of elaborate psychological game. Do you really think this is the right decision? Yes, I answered without hesitation. It's the only right thing to do in this situation. Edward got up from his chair and headed out of the living room. He stopped at the door and turned to me. "I need time to think about this," he said quietly. "And I need to talk to Chelsea." "Of course you do. But remember, the decision's already been made and it's not negotiable." "We'll see," he said, a note of stubbornness in his voice for the first time during the conversation. "We'll see, Mom." I sat in the empty living room for a long time after he left, thinking about the conversation. Edward was shocked and upset, but not broken. In his last words, I heard echoes of the stubborn boy he'd been as a child, when he disagreed with my decisions. He might try to find a way to make me change my mind, but I was prepared for that eventuality, and I wasn't going to back down from my decision. At 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, I signed the new will in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. The ceremony was quick and businesslike. Ronald read out the main provisions of the document. I signed each page. The witnesses confirmed that I was acting of my own free will and in my right mind. In half an hour, everything was finished, and I left the lawyer's office with the feeling that the bridges had been burned completely and irrevocably. The next days passed in a strange silence, which at first seemed unusual to me, and then became almost soothing. The phone rang less often than usual, only automated messages from the bank, calls offering various services, and rare conversations with neighbors on everyday matters. No one in the family tried to contact me, which was both painful and understandable. Edward needed time to process what had happened and decide how to proceed. On Tuesday morning, as I was watering the flowers in the front garden, Edward's car pulled up. I saw him sitting behind the wheel, looking at my house, but he didn't get out. He sat like that for about 10 minutes, apparently gathering his thoughts or struggling internally, and then he started the engine and drove away. This episode was repeated on Wednesday evening. My son came, sat in the car at my house for a while, but never dared to come to the door. Around noon on Thursday, the phone rang and Edward's name appeared on the display. I stared at the ringing machine, but didn't pick up. After the 5th ring, the answering machine came on, and I heard my son's voice, which sounded tired and worried. "Mom, it's me. Please call me back. We need to talk." I think we can find a solution that works for everyone. There's no need to take things to extremes. The message was short, but I could hear a note of desperation in Edward's voice that made my heart clench with pain. Still, I didn't call back. The decision was made, and no amount of persuasion could make me back out of it. Friday morning, Chelsea came to see me. I saw her from the kitchen window. She walked down the path to my house slowly, with obvious reluctance, as if she were forcing herself to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. She was dressed strictly, businesslike, her hair in a neat bundle, her face a look of determination mixed with fatigue. When the bell rang, I didn't open the door. I stood in the hallway, listening to Chelsea ring the bell over and over, then knock on the door and call my name. Through the glass inset, I could see her silhouette, but I didn't move from my spot. After about 15 minutes, she gave up and left, leaving a small bouquet of flowers at the door and a note that I didn't read until later that evening. "Rita, I realize that our conversation on Wednesday upset you, but please don't make drastic decisions in a state of resentment. Edward is very worried and I don't want our family to fall apart because of a misunderstanding. Maybe we could get together and talk things out calmly. Chelsea." The note was written in neat handwriting, without grammatical errors, polite and diplomatic. It didn't have any of the emotion that had been in Chelsea's voice the last time we'd spoken. Apparently, she was trying to find a compromise that would keep the appearance of a family relationship without compromising her own interests. But I wasn't going to compromise. For too many years, I had been adapting to circumstances, searching for a middle ground between my own desires and the needs of others. Now, at 73, I was determined to do solely what I thought was right, without looking at how it might upset or offend others. The phone was silent on weekends. On Saturdays, Edward usually called me in the morning to see how I was doing, to see if there were any problems that required his involvement. That ritual was gone now, and Saturday passed in complete silence, broken only by the sounds of the street, the barking of dogs, the noise of passing cars, the voices of children playing in the courtyards. Sunday was quiet, too. I read, cooked, watched TV, did housework. No one called, no one came, and gradually I began to get used to this new reality, in which I existed as a completely autonomous unit, not bound by close obligations to other people. On Monday, exactly 1 week after the new will was signed, I woke up with a clear understanding of what had happened in those 7 days. Edward and Chelsea had made several attempts to reestablish contact, but when they were rebuffed, they gave up and stopped insisting. It meant that they'd accepted my decision as final and weren't going to waste any more energy trying to reconcile. On the one hand, this was exactly what I wanted to achieve: complete independence and freedom from family obligations. On the other hand, the price of that freedom was higher than I had anticipated. I hadn't just distanced myself from my son's family, I had lost them almost completely, and rebuilding the relationship now seemed unlikely. On Tuesday night, as I sat in the living room with a book, it suddenly became very clear to me that I would never again see Edward as the loving, caring son who came to visit just to spend time with his mother. If we did see each other in the future, it would be formal, polite contact on special occasions, birthdays, major holidays, maybe family celebrations, if there were any. The thought was painful, but I forced myself to accept it as the inevitable cost of my decision. I had chosen pride and integrity over flexibility and compromise. Now I had to live with the consequences of that choice. On Wednesday afternoon, I met Doris Hammond, a neighbor who had visited me the previous week on the street. We said hello, and she tried, as usual, to strike up a conversation about the local news. "I haven't seen Edward for a long time," she said casually. "He used to come by on weekends." "Yeah, he's got a lot on his plate right now," I said evasively. "Work, family stuff." Doris looked at me carefully, apparently sensing that there was more behind my words than just his son's busyness. "How are you? Are you all right? You look a little tired." "I'm fine. I'm just getting older." We said goodbye, and Doris went on her way, but I noticed that she turned around several times, looking at me with a concerned expression. Apparently, the changes in my behavior and appearance were noticeable to those around me, even if I tried not to show it. Thursday night, as I was making dinner, the phone rang. This time it was Chelsea, but I didn't pick up the phone, just like the last time. The answering machine recorded a short message. "Rita, it's Chelsea. I know you don't want to talk to us, but please think about what you're doing not only to us, but to yourself. Edward is very worried, and I think we're all acting too hastily. Goodbye." I could hear a note of genuine concern in her voice that wasn't in the first note. Maybe Chelsea was beginning to realize that her ultimatum had led to consequences she hadn't foreseen or wanted, but it was too late to make a change. Friday morning, I woke up feeling a deep fatigue that seemed to penetrate my very bones. The week of isolation from my family had been harder on me than I had anticipated. The house seemed too big and quiet, the usual chores too meaningless and mechanical. I began to realize that life without loved ones, even if the relationship with them was complicated and problematic, was much emptier than I had imagined. In the evening, I sat in my favorite chair by the window with a cup of tea and tried to honestly assess what had happened during this week. I had achieved exactly what I had been striving for: complete independence from family obligations and freedom from having to consider the opinions and desires of others. But this victory of principles over feelings left a taste of bitterness and loneliness. Outside the window, dusk was slowly falling. The street lamps were lighting up, and life in the neighboring houses went on as usual. In the house across the street, the young Bruces were having dinner in front of the TV. Further down the street, someone was walking their dog. and quiet music was coming from the window of the third house. The whole world went on living a normal, measured life, full of human connections and relationships. And I sat alone in my quiet house, surrounded by the things that would one day be Claire's, and realized that the price of being principled was much higher than I had bargained for. But there was no going back. Too much had been said and done, and the wounds were too deep. My pride wouldn't let me make the first step toward reconciliation, and Edward's and Chelsea's pride wouldn't let them continue to try to repair the relationship after such a clear rejection from me. We were at an impasse, and there was no way out of it for either party. Finishing my tea, I went upstairs to my bedroom to get ready for bed. The mirror on the dressing table reflected the face of a lonely old woman who had won a principled battle, but lost the war for human happiness. It was a fair but sad victory that I had to live with for the rest of my life,